And I don't want to make it different. There we go. So that means for those of you who are watching, you'll also have a prompt that says, do you allow recording? If you're not showing your face, it doesn't really matter anyway, but I think you'll still have to agree, or it probably will keep you out of it. So thanks for coming, and thank you, Stephanie, for inviting me. This is one of the areas that I've spent probably the last 6 months deep diving into around menopause and burnout because a lot of the links are not actually made. And as we go through, you'll see then some of the challenges that happen when we start looking at where that crossover comes into hypermobile people and some of the other challenges that that might present when we get into perimenopause or menopause and, what we need to be aware of. So just having a look at burnout generally. So just making a note, this is the Edge Empowerment website is a new website. It's part of the work that I'm building up doing in the UK next year. So that website is still actually under construction, but you can note it because if you seeing this a bit later, it's probably then already published. But it's talking about what if burnout isn't just about doing too much, but in the case of hypermobile people in particular, what if it's about holding too much for too long in a body that's not able to stabilize itself? And that's one of the challenges that we have to work through, right? So, who am I to talk to you about all of this stuff? I was once written up as Australia's most influential woman in mental health, but one of the top 5 leaders in terms of driving remarkable global transformations. Why? Because I tend to see a problem, resolve it for myself, and then go, oh my goodness, everybody needs to know about this. So just happens to be one of the byproducts of what I'm going to say, my own neurodiversity. And I always ask for this bit of a permission to be vulnerable because like a lot of people where we get into an area of specialty, it's often because you've had some level of lived experience yourself. About 3 years ago, I burnt out to such a significant level that I literally closed the doors on my business and walked away. Left Australia. I mean, I never do things by halves. I didn't just close the business and work out what I was going to do next. I closed the door on what was a very successful and busy business at the time, but sold my house, packed up, moved halfway around the world, and started everything again from scratch. Not something that everybody would think that was the best solution to their burnout issue, but in my case, it felt like the right thing to do at the time. What I recognized in the last 12 months is actually for a large part of that because and in the initial stages, I became a digital nomad. I was actually chasing dopamine to kind of keep my energy levels up because a lot of my hormone depletion was actually impacting, and I didn't even realize that that was what the problem was. And it wasn't even until the beginning of this year, and I had been on HRT replacing estrogen alone for about 2.5 years. But then at the beginning of this year, when we sort of did a full blood analysis, actually I had zero estrogen because it turns out that when you take an oral tablet, if you've got any kind of gut issues, then you're not absorbing it. And if you've got any kind of form of leaky gut, then you're just not absorbing what you tend to take orally as well as you can in other forms. When I realized the impact that that had had on my body and actually on my mental health and my functioning in general, I then started down a bit of a path of research around more, what's actually happening. Why did my menopause itself, which to be honest was no big deal, I didn't, I had a few kind of symptoms, I would say, a few hot flushes, few night sweats, went to the doctor. The doctor said, oh, you're done, without ever explaining what that actually meant or what I should be looking for. So, as part of that challenge, then I really wanted to understand, well, what was going on in terms of hormonal health. And then how does hormonal health actually impact mental health? Because I think that they are absolutely closely aligned, and we do not assess people's endocrinology when we actually look at their mental health. And I think that that's actually the wrong thing to do. So when we talk about symptom convergence, this is often what we see in perimenopause symptoms, where a lot of people will be talking about a sense of feeling anxious for no real reason. All of a sudden, we seem to have more gut pain and things. We've got joint instability that comes up. A lot of people will talk about suddenly getting, mad and angry and not feeling that they can control that as much. And it seems out of character for them, I want to say. Memory issues can come up. One of the biggest problems is always a level of insomnia or just sleep issues in general. Now, one of the problems with sleep is that a lot of people, when they're put on any level of HRT, they're not necessarily given progesterone. Some people are only given an estrogen supplementation. And one of the problems with that is that actually progesterone is one of the major precursors in terms of sleep. So if you've got sleep issues, then you really need to be looking at, well, what are the other hormonal elements involved? And to be honest, most of the medical providers still are hooked up on some things and quite frankly, research that's more than 20 years old and completely inaccurate. So you're not crazy, you're not lazy, but you are overloaded. And how do we have a look at what do we do about that? So one of the problems with menopause is it's a multi-system crash. So we get this hormonal trajectory that actually destabilizes the system. It's not just about brain function. It also starts to affect cognitive tissue, the connective tissue, I mean, not cognitive. See, I should put my glasses back on. And then, we start talking about things like what happens within our gut health. So we've got this multifaceted kind of system already, most of us prior to hitting menopause, but then menopause further destabilizes it. And we don't even get this information from our medical practitioners because most of them they're not aware of it. They don't understand what's actually happening in the system. And a lot of people have been frightened by research that talks about HRT increasing cancer risk, which even though that's since been debunked, and actually in the last 20 odd years since that research came out, a lot of the HRT preparations have had their formulations changed. But a lot of people are still really scared. And I find even a lot of women, particularly in Australia, will say to me that, if there's any family history of breast cancer, then their GP will just refuse to even give them the option. And one of the problems that I have with that is that when we start talking about menopause generally, there are a lot of other challenges that we get that aren't simply related to, hot flushes. And in fact, hot flushes is probably the least of your problems. So the other thing that happens, and particularly with hypermobile women, is we get this hormone collagen cortisol axis. So when our estrogen declines, we also have a heightened level of cortisol. And the problem is that post-menopause, we actually end up with cortisol causing a bigger problem than what it would in a premenopausal woman. So what am I saying? Cortisol is our normal stress hormone, and as our stress hormone, it actually is naturally released when we're under any sort of pressure or stress. But it also gets released when we exercise and a number of other different sort of points in our life where our cortisol levels naturally rise. After menopause, our cortisol levels don't spike in the morning, which is what they need to do. So normally they would spike and then they would reduce down and then they would ease right off until by the time you get to bedtime, they're quite low. In a postmenopausal woman, they don't spike in the morning. They only kind of go up about halfway and they stay high and remain elevated during the day. And the problem is that then when we experience a stressful event, when we're past menopause, usually that 2 to 3 year mark post menopause, if you have a stressor, a major stressor, your body cannot actually process it in the same way that it used to. I talk about the fact that we have limited resilience after that. So things that we should bounce back from, things that would normally make a whole lot of, eventually we would calm down and our system would relax. It doesn't happen. It stays elevated and it stays on hyperarousal to the point that a postmenopausal body actually has 4 times the impact from cortisol than what a premenopausal body does. So that's a really important point because a lot of women tend to find that too many stresses when they reach that point in their life make things not manageable. So what we find is that the largest sort of dropout rate for women working is around age 54. Now, they'll use different excuses about why they don't want to work anymore at that point, but usually it comes from a cognitive overwhelm. So, and then we end up with this faulty connective tissue sort of base, and then we have this systemic physical and emotional fatigue because your body is just physically not keeping up. So one of the biggest things that happened with me was I was dealing with chronic pain anyway. I've been dealing with chronic pain, I want to say, for the better part, probably 15, 20 years or so. I did have some accidents when I was younger. My body doesn't necessarily, deal with those muscular sort of changes because, being hypermobile, what happens? Well, we've got, I would say the lax bits, my joints don't necessarily stay exactly where they're supposed to be. Stephanie can explain this better than me, the connective tissue elements, it's just kind of like all a little bit too flexible. So in my 40s, I started back in the gym doing, high intensity interval training because I knew that even though it was painful for me to get into that regular routine of training, I actually knew that it was going to make a difference in terms of the physical muscle structure would then help me potentially to hold everything else where it should be. But, this is part of the challenge then when we get older. What do we do when this axis breaks down? That hormone, collagen, cortisol axis. What we know from a mental health perspective, I talk about the HPA axis involving your pituitary, and your adrenals, and things get overloaded and you just don't function the same way that you used to. Now, for some people, they're able to manage that and ease into it depending on what is going on in their life. And I want to say also depending on what level of support that they have. But when we talk about the science of burnout, we've got physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion. We're not just talking about one thing here because one thing could be managed a little bit better. But post-menopause, we also see higher levels of general reported aches and pains, aches in the joints, pain just in general movement, getting up in the morning. And anybody who's ever done it, we used to look at our mothers when they get out of bed and they'd be kind of like moving really slowly, and you're thinking to yourself, that's kind of funny at the time. But, now when you get to that age and you think, oh, I'm doing my mother's walk, it's kind of like, it's not really funny at all. It's quite painful and I don't like it. But burnout is not just a mental health issue. So we get pain flare-ups, we get higher levels of reported pain post-menopause, which is a really big issue. One of the most common things that is reported by postmenopausal women is frozen shoulder. Nobody's even really sure about why that is the case, but it is so common in postmenopausal women. It's probably the number one reported issue. We get other neuralgia issues. We get, different things that will affect nerve pathways in the body. And nobody can kind of, definitively say exactly why that is, but we do understand that with the breakdown and the loss of estrogen, that we do have some of these other challenges. The beginning of this year, when I did this analysis on my hormones, I kind of went, I was absolutely gobsmacked that I'd been on estrogen for 2.5 years and yet my levels were still zero. But I was grateful because I was in Greece, and in Greece I was prescribed not only bioidentical estrogen and progesterone, but I was also prescribed bioidentical testosterone. And it was about 4 months, I think, in. And I remember I had a conversation with Stephanie on the phone and I said, my pain's not giving me as much, well, it wasn't giving me as much hassle at the end of every day. I had previously had to take painkillers every night. I was constantly out there with a heat pack, usually by mid-afternoon, my back, my shoulders, different points, my hips, depending on what was happening. I had a sit sand desk. I had all of these things to kind of help me manage it. But the reality was that if I spent too much time on the computer, or sometimes even if I'd not touched the computer, who knows what else I'd done during the day. But mid-afternoon comes and I'm looking for a heat pack and definitely taking painkillers. It got to be about June, and I'd started on all three elements of my now HRT regime in I was end of February, beginning of March. And not only did I feel mentally stronger, I got to a point where I really felt like I suddenly woke up one morning and I went, oh my goodness, I'm back. And that was the first time I'd felt like that in probably about 3 years, where I felt like I could handle anything that came my way. And then I started to get some level of drive back. The interesting elements about, things that I was always interested in before, even this sort of stuff, educating others about, what's really going on. But for a couple of years, I wasn't interested in that. I was in survival mode, trying to manage my own stuff and trying to manage, how I make these adjustments for myself. When I realized actually that I was back and I was suddenly not requiring the same level of pain management that I had been before, I said to Stephanie, I wonder if it's the testosterone, because it was the only thing that made some sense to me. And then we had this conversation because I'd also remembered that when I was working with patients previously and I had patients who were transgendering, that those who went from female to male seem to actually have a better mental health outcome than those who transition from male to female. Now, a lot of people would have said, just from a purely psychological perspective, that there were lots of adjustments to be made, but there is as many adjustments to be made, going from female to male as there is from male to female, but there's a big difference in the hormones that you're given. And so then we started to do a little bit more research, and Stephanie went to a training, professional development thing. There was a neurologist, no, a rheumatologist from New Zealand, and he was talking about the fact that low-level testosterone use in women with chronic pain seemed to be having really positive outcomes and impact. And I was like, so testosterone use is maybe one of those things that's a pretty important element in terms of how we might be able to manage. And I think generally that I probably prior to menopause had naturally higher levels of testosterone anyway. So why does standard care fail us then? The traditional medical model, it's often kind of seen, it's, symptom focused, often when there's complexity. And, I hate to say it, but if you get a chance to watch, there was a really cool podcast on Diary of a CEO talking about reproductive kind of health in general. There were four doctors looking at varying elements of our reproductive life, I suppose. And one of them was specializing in menopause. And the most interesting part of that whole discussion, though, was the fact that they said a lot of women, when they have these complex presentations, particularly in hospital environments, that their files get marked with a WW. And WW basically stands for whinging woman. We gaslight these women because the medical system doesn't understand actually what's going on. And it wasn't until the 1990s that was even a focus on ensuring that women were included in standard research, scientific research protocols. So there's a lot of things that we are told that, this is not fair or reasonable, or it's a bit outside the norm, or there's nothing really wrong with you, that's often based on men's health data, not women's health data. And so this becomes a huge issue, compounded by the fact that the majority of health research funding is spent on men's health research, and women's health research only gets about 1/10 of the funding that men's health research gets. And in terms of, medical focus and the reproductive space, basically the society kind of seems to think that women cease to exist the minute they stop becoming reproductive. And I say to a lot of people, it's interesting because we are only one of two species that actually goes through menopause at all. Humans are one and the others are orcas. But in an orca environment, they actually have a whole, focus on what those senior women do, how they lead the pod, how they train the children, how they look after things while the parents go off to hunt. We don't have a space for postmenopausal women in this society at all. In most Western societies, they're expected to be invisible and disappear into the background. And yet we are now expecting people to work until they're 70 years old. And you are expecting women to cognitively show up and make a contribution for 40% of their working life. We all start working around the age of 20. If you really want me to work for 50 years, how do you expect me to work for 20 of those years without the cognitive ability to do it because I don't have the hormonal structure to help me actually process things? So we're thankfully getting more and more people talking about what's really going on in menopause and what's really going on in our hormonal health. And my research over this last 6 months, as a psychologist, my psychology background, I was a registered psychologist in Australia. I'm not anymore. I'm now focused on the UK. But when I was operating here, I used to be aware that there were definitely some mental health issues that seemed to have a hormonal basis or were made worse by hormonal functioning changes over the normal kind of, monthly course. But we'd never really focused on it or discussed it. And we never actually do a blood test based on, somebody reporting what they're experiencing emotionally. So nobody in the medical system would give you a blood test if you're reporting mental health symptoms. And yet most of the mental health symptoms, I honestly believe, are driven by endocrinology. So you should actually do a full detailed blood analysis, regardless of where you're at in terms of anything that feels like it's an emotionally driven point. So menopause is not just hot flushes. It affects every cell in the body. So, we've got autonomic function problems that come up. We've got cognitive function, not being able to think clearly, losing your, thoughts. It's kind of what I used to laughingly call brain farts, that kind of like you're on a track and then it just disappears somewhere into the ether. But we also have problems with gut motility. And, when you have some of those hypermobility symptoms anyway, you usually tend to have gut motility problems already. And these things just sort of become a little bit worse when you don't have some of these additional hormones in your system. And then your collagen integrity. So we've got reduced joint stability, increased pain, and slower healing. Things that when you're in the hypermobile space, you've already probably got in droves anyway, and somehow it just seems to get a little bit worse. So part of this is like, well, what's the answer? We don't want to sit there and just kind of go, oh, well, it's just going to get worse and you just have to suck it up and put up with it. You really want to empower yourself to ask for very specific evidence-based care. Now, in order to do that these days, unfortunately, you usually have to push quite hard with medical practitioners, especially GPs. In Australia, one of the challenges, even if you want the detailed blood test that I tell everybody you should have, we now provide a handout for you to take to the GP because the GP needs to be able to find some clinical justification for why that level of blood work is required. Most of the time, if they're just looking at whether you're in menopause or not, they're only looking at a couple of different markers, but you want to have a look at all of it. You want to know whether or not you've got high levels of cortisol. So you want to do a cortisol assessment. You want to have a look at what's going on in your blood sugars because one of the most common things post-menopause is developing insulin resistance. That's why women put on weight around their middle. It's not just because you're getting lazy and you're not working hard. Even when I've been in the gym and you see a lot of postmenopausal women, they might be quite thin in lots of other parts of their body, but they're carrying weight specifically around their belly. And it's hormonal. And we can do things to change it. So what helps? This is about what's the support pyramid that you need to be having a look at. So you want to have a look right at the foundation at your hormonal support because it's the basis upon which any other therapy stands. So HRT under medical guidance, and I really want to say if you've never thought about it or you didn't think you necessarily needed it, a lot of the things that happened to me, I never linked to menopause. I really had no idea that menopause was the driver for what had happened to me in terms of my burnout until I ended up going on a full kind of replenishment of my hormone levels and then kind of went, oh my God, I cannot believe that my deterioration had happened because it's slow and you don't actually recognize that that's what's happening to you. So, I encourage people when they're in that perimenopause space, if, they notice any sort of symptoms, but even if you're not having huge symptoms, because for me, to be honest, menopause itself wasn't that big a deal. I probably had a couple of months where I was having noticeable hot flushes, and then I'd had the blood test, and basically the doctor says, you're done. I'm like, nobody even talked to me about what that meant or what I should be looking out for because nobody talks about what can happen to you post-menopause. It's just not something that we discuss. We discuss all of the symptom elements, but then it's like once you're done, and it's like you're invisible to the medical profession. So then we want to have a look at nervous system training and support, looking at vagal training and pacing, sleep hygiene, and looking at gentle sort of somatic strength. So it's about sleep hygiene is one of the biggest things, I think, in terms of managing cortisol as well, because cortisol, there's some really simple things that we can do to help our cortisol functioning. One of the most simple is waking up and getting outside and looking directly at the sun within 30 minutes. Ideally, you can go up to an hour, but ideally within 30 minutes of waking. 5 minutes looking directly at the sun. Somebody said to me, but can't that damage your eyes? And I said, yeah, well, you can hood the eyes or whatever. And unfortunately in Australia, the sun is really stronger. But the reality is what it does is it spikes your cortisol. The other thing that will spike your cortisol is having cool water at the end of the shower. Now, a lot of people kind of go, I hate that cold water idea. I'm not talking cold. It doesn't have to be, stand there until you're freezing. It's the sense of just turning the water down and making it cooler on your body for a minimum of 30 seconds before you kind of shut the shower off completely. I know really hard to do in a Canberra winter, but it really does make a difference. One of the things in terms of that cool down in the body, so what I do instead is if it's cooler outside, then I'm not putting on a robe or anything to go out and sit in the sun. I'm just going out in my pajamas and letting my body actually feel the cool air because that does a similar kind of thing. The other thing is that if you exercise in any form, you need to make sure that you're reducing your exercise focus to not be so heavy on your cardio stuff because it puts more pressure on your body, and look at doing more strength training, but making sure that you do it before lunchtime, ideally before 11 a.m. The earlier in the day, the better. So then, that helps with the sleep hygiene at the other end of the day. It's like making sure that you're eliminating blue light from your system basically towards the end of the night. You know, I think we've all been there where you kind of watching TV and you get another episode and you go, oh, just one more episode, but it's making that clear decision to really help your sleep hygiene by turning the TV off at 9:30 and making sure that the lights are low and, getting yourself a nice cup of, sleep herbal tea and trying to support your system in its wind down. And then, reading when you get into bed is often a good way to just bring your brain down altogether. The other thing helps if you get any anxious sleep cycle, like waking in the middle of the night with a lot of stuff going through your head, making sure that you just jot down anything that's bothering you. And it doesn't have to be a journal specifically, but any exercise book by the bed will help. And just jotting down anything that's bothering you that you haven't actually worked through in that day. Because your brain will keep you awake if you haven't solved the problem. Then the systemic recognition. So looking at workplace flexibility, informed clinicians, and social validation and support. Unfortunately, in Australia, a lot of the workplace flexibility things are not yet in place. They technically do fit under a whole range of, standard provisions around access to leave for health purposes. So trying to make sure they give more recognition to mental health specifically than they do to menopause in this country. So it doesn't matter what you call it, but making sure that you access it, recognizing that sometimes when sleep is a problem that, the early morning starts can be a little bit of an issue, and maybe you want to talk about flexible work arrangements where you can work a bit later in the day. Um, just making some of those changes. And when you do notice that you are feeling quite tired and exhausted, see whether or not you can reduce your hours back, whether that's shorter days. For some people, they find, taking a day off in the week can, be a real reset, replenishment for the body. Other people kind of find shorter working days more helpful. Just depends on what really works for you, but trying to have that flexibility. Part of the reason that I'm working with and setting up Edge Empowerment in the UK is because the UK government have actually started menopause action plans as mandatory for all large corporates from next year. So next year they become voluntary, but from 2027 they're mandatory. Won't be that long before Australia follows suit. But, there is hope in the hormones. It's not your fault, it's biology, and your biology can actually be supported. We look to hormones to help stabilize the nervous system. It helps to return your cognitive clarity, and also renew your physical energy. So one of the reasons I called Edge was because it looks at energy, drive, growth, and expertise, because a lot of women, when they go through this menopause phase in their life, feel like a lot of their, you know, value and expertise is no longer relevant to their workplace, and they feel a little bit like they're a bit superseded. And that comes with a level of what we call anhedonia from a psychological perspective. This sense of life just being a bit blah and nobody really kind of interested in what goes on in the day to day. And I'm sure some of you would have seen some of the news things around, women who actually do become, can become suicidal at this point in their life. And, it's not the traditional kind of way that we normally would see in standard depression things. It's almost this feeling of, well, if this is all there is to life, what's the point? And if there's any level of neurodiversity, I think that actually that's even stronger. So it's one of those things to just be very conscious of. So I'm writing a new book on menopause and burnout, and one of the things that I talk about is, my journey feeling like, it was definitely a phoenix moment where I was like, all my life felt like it was definitely razed to the ground, and uh, and then rebuilding from understanding what has actually gone on in my body from menopause, and being able to get access to the right kind of hormone replacement therapy to support that. Um, you know, it really makes me aware that menopause isn't a breakdown. I just wish I'd understood what I know now 3 years ago. I could have saved myself so much hassle, really. But, it is a biological call to transformation. And the other thing that I really do believe, and it's just part of the way I've always operated, you know, somebody has to go through the negative experience to be able to actually understand what's going on. And, I'm probably one of the only people in the world talking about HPA axis depletion in postmenopausal women right now, because it's not an area of focus. And if you're not a person who's suffered from it or experienced it, why would you care? And it's not an area that researchers focus on because, it's not one of those things that we tend to sort of stand out and talk about, because a lot of women in my circumstances would have just disappeared into the ether and never to be heard of again. Um, I'm not really cut from that cloth, so it wasn't going to be an okay thing for me. I got to the end of last year and I went, I've applied all of my psychological kind of processes to what I'm experiencing, and it hasn't changed anything, and I didn't understand it. So that's what kind of put me on this path of looking for what's going on next. So your biological imperative to move from awareness to advocacy, that involves 3 steps. So one is trusting your symptoms. Your body is communicating, not failing. So validating your own experience is taking that first step. And I think it's really important. I don't think anybody would be part of this group if they weren't actually validating their experiences. I think it's a good thing to understand and understand your body. Demand full care, don't settle for fragmented treatment. And it's very difficult in this society, I want to say, to get that kind of comprehensive approach. Even in the health practitioner area, which I've been involved in for many years in Australia, but even when I worked in multidisciplinary clinics, it was very difficult to get true multidisciplinary care. But I think we're getting better at it. And I think when we see one practitioner who recommends you see another practitioner with a different specialty. Usually it's because they know that there's some experience and understanding across these same sort of issues. And then reclaiming authority, because it's your transformation, right? You want to take ownership of that transformation for yourself. And that's part of the reason why, in the 4-week program that I've put together, I really encourage people to feel that they're quite within their rights to ask their health practitioners for what they want. Unfortunately, we tend to be given a bit of a God complex around our doctors, and if they say no, we don't tend to push back. And I think it's an important thing to do. So if you're interested, this is a detailed burnout risk assessment. If you were concerned that maybe you thought you were at risk and you want to have a look at it, this is a 32 question questionnaire, and you can have a look at that. What you'll get at the end of that too is there's a short ebook talking about Refocus and Rise. So giving you information about what you can do to support yourself if you're feeling a bit burnt out, and what you might want to do about that on the, moving forward. All right, so coming to the end of my talking head, I'm just wondering if there was one thing in particular that maybe was helpful. If you're online, you want to unmute yourself and, speak up about what you found helpful. Anybody in the room find things helpful? I always find that, a lot of people tend to hear something that they didn't expect, or, get some validation for something that they didn't even realize was one of those things that they were experiencing. And it doesn't matter if you're all a bit shy and don't want to talk about that. I've got somebody in the chat, Cecilia.
Yeah, it's kind of helpful, but also more of a statement. What I've noticed broadly, speaking from an Aboriginal woman's perspective, that I noticed science catch up with what we know for thousands of years. And when you look at our culture, we're a matriarchal society, and Aboriginal elder women are revered and held up, and it's the same concept, that,
Yep.
People go out and go, like thousands of years ago, to go out and get the food and all of that. But an Aboriginal women, older women are held with respect and care, and we're called witches in
the white world.
Yeah,
exactly.
Older,
Yep. Yeah. If you're a wise woman, yes, then there must be something wrong with you.
I believe that every culture has sort of the First Nations people, and you look at paganism and you've got the crow, the age of the crow.
Yep.
So I think science and everything that you've said, you've broken it down so eloquently, is that science is catching up with what we know for thousands of years. Yeah.
And it is catching up, but I think the other thing that's happening is that our mothers, and I certainly know my mother, never ever really spoke about what had happened in her own menopause. It was almost like it was just an unspoken thing. It was something that they had to kind of put up with and deal with. And I notice it actually in Greece now too, because you see a lot of the older yayas, because they actually retire at 55 there. So there's a community kind of element that just transitions them out, but it gives them a space where they're usually looking after their grandchildren. It's a normal part of how the hierarchical kind of family structure works. They often live in the same building. They have different parts of the building, but they live in a family compound. So it's a very different kind of, perspective, and the value of family is seen quite differently too. And, I don't think that we have that in our white Western society, where we have very much that nuclear family base. It's you, your husband, your children, and, that's the end of it. And then they grow up and they leave home and they go on and they marry somebody else. And it's kind of like this, again, little nuclear pocket. It's a very different way of looking at things. All right. So Julia said she's been put on estrogen, and it was interesting to hear about testosterone. Yes. So if you're interested in testosterone, you can now. So it's good because in Australia, HRT has now been put back on the PBS, which was only recent. So that's a positive thing. The other part of that, though, is that you can only usually access testosterone if you talk about the fact that there is a sexual dysfunction. And that really annoys me, but that's the reality. So if you want to try and look at testosterone use at a low level, and I'm going to say, even if the reason you want to use it is to see if you can address chronic pain, then I'm going to say, go and tell them that you're really not enjoying your sex life so that they'll give you some. It's just the reality of, unfortunately, the way we have to do things sometimes.
Sort of follow on comments last
Yeah.
question from that. I've watched two friends become trans men.
Yep.
And they both had the experience of going on testosterone.
Yep.
All of their joint issues go away.
Yes.
All of a sudden they can build strength and mental health problems that they've had their entire lives and just not
Go away.
existed. Just incredible.
Yes.
And you said you had a handout to take to your GP.
Yes.
I'll
print it up for you.
Yeah.
I'll also post it online.
So the handout in terms of the blood work you should have is something a bit different. It's not in that handout, but I can pull it up on the screen. You can take a picture of it so that you can go. But it's yeah, because it's actually part of this 4-week menopause accelerator that I run. So the first thing that we do in the first week of this 4-week program is actually give you the breakdown of all of the things that you need to do to have a look at your blood work.
Yep.
But then also talking about, so what's going on in your mind, what's going on in your life, what's going on in your hormones. So in the first week, you get given all of the stuff to go and get the blood work done. And then in the third week, we actually do a complete analysis of that blood work alongside a psychological assessment of all of the things that are going on in your life and any medications or anything that you're on, and ask you all sorts of things, even about, sleep and how you do different things. And then I've created a tool that actually synthesizes all of that information and then produces a report that explains to you exactly what's happening and why. So yeah. So, and that's part of this 4-week accelerator that I'm doing that'll start in the new year. So if you go to that QR code, it'll actually give you an opportunity to register your interest, because I'm still in the process of, like I said, building the new website, and this will become sort of the individual entry point on the new website for that program. So the 4-week accelerator for me, because I think one of the things that happens in this space is that we give out far too much just generic information. And what you need to understand as an individual person is that, what's going on in your body, although you might have some similarities to a friend, it's not exactly the same. And somebody needs to take you through exactly what your blood results are telling you. And to be honest, medical practitioners don't do it. And so this was part of why I created this program, was because it needs to be in depth, and it's not even something that we can do just over 1 week. So this is like a 4-week group coaching program. So you're in with a group of other women who are in similar positions. They might not all be in exactly the same space that you are, but it gives you that kind of baseline, and then you get your own individualized plan. And then at the end, you're basically given a 12-week recovery program that says, okay, in order to correct these things, these are the things that you should look at. It gives you your recommended HRT options, but even if you choose not to go down the HRT path, there are other options that you can look at from a biohacking perspective, taking certain supplements and different things as well. So if that sounds of interest, just register your interest for it, and then when we make it live, you'll be able to get into that. So all my books are on my website, kerryannhoward.com. You can have a look. Those 4 books are already there. My background was as a trauma psychologist here. The book How to Heal a Workplace was the last one that I brought out, which was at the beginning of 23. So I'm working on a new book at the moment, as I said, around menopause and burnout. And that should be out next year. And then that's me if you want to get in contact for any reason with regards to any questions or anything else from today. But yeah, there you go. And I took a whole hour. I said to Stephanie, how long do you take?
We started at 10 past.
Yeah, she's like 10 minutes, 20 minutes presentation, whatever, but
Actually, presentation part, then talk.
Yeah. So I can stop sharing that. I don't know if anybody who's, tuned in from home wants to unmute and get in on the conversation, or whether we'll just have a further
Or if
you
you
know,
process it
chat.
later, you can always send through questions. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, if there's any other questions, either through the Facebook group or because Stephanie will send out a bit of a link to some of the resource things from today. And then, yeah, if there's any questions or whatever, you can put it back through to the group or send an email, and happy to answer whatever people would like to find out about. Okay,
That's it, that's your pattern.
that's all right. I'll hand back over to Stephanie.
I'm just going to.
Julia says, "You're welcome." She just said, "Thanks. That was informative."
Now can I have some water?
All right.